The watchful neighbor. I moved into a quiet suburban neighborhood to escape the bustle of the city, but peace was the last thing I found. My neighbor, Mrs. Anderson, lived in the house next door. At first, she seemed like any other elderly neighbor, but it didn't take long for her behavior to take a sinister turn. Every evening, I would catch glimpses of her through the curtains, peering out at my house. At first, I dismissed it as simple curiosity, but her obsession grew. She began to stand in her window for hours, just staring at me. One night, as I sat in my living room, I felt a strange sensation prickling at the back of my neck. I turned to see Mrs. Anderson pressed against the glass, her eyes locked onto mine. Her face contorted into a wicked grin, and she raised a finger to her lips, as if warning me to stay silent. Terrified, I called the police, but when they arrived, Mrs. Anderson was nowhere to be found. They assured me that they would keep an eye on things, but I couldn't shake the feeling that her watchful gaze was always on me. Weeks turned into months, and I felt like a prisoner in my own home. Mrs. Anderson's sinister obsession continued, and I could no longer sleep at night, knowing that she was out there, lurking in the darkness. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard a soft tapping at my window. My heart raced as I saw her face, pressed against the glass. She whispered, "I'm always watching." I screamed and fled my house, never looking back. I moved far away, but I still can't escape the memory of Mrs. Anderson and her watchful eyes. A reminder that sometimes the scariest horror can be found right next door. The Midnight Visitor. My new neighbor, Mr. Jacobs, was an odd one from the start. He lived alone in a dilapidated house at the end of the street. He rarely spoke to anyone and seemed to have a penchant for the macabre. His lawn was adorned with creepy statues and eerie decorations. One night, I was startled awake by a loud crash coming from Mr. Jacobs' yard. I peered out the window and saw him, dressed in a tattered black robe, standing before a flickering bonfire. He chanted in a language I couldn't understand, waving his arms wildly. As I watched, a group of shadowy figures emerged from the darkness, circling the fire. Their movements were jerky and unnatural, like marionettes being controlled by invisible strings. My heart pounded as I realized that Mr. Jacobs was conducting some kind of sinister ritual. I knew I had to call the police, but when they arrived, the yard was empty, and there was no sign of Mr. Jacobs or his eerie gathering. I couldn't shake the feeling that something dark and malevolent lived next door. Night after night, I would hear strange noises emanating from his house. Whispers, footsteps, and eerie laughter that echoed through the walls. One evening, as I returned home, I found a disturbing note pinned to my front door. It was written in a language I couldn't understand, filled with cryptic symbols and drawings of grotesque creatures. At the bottom, it simply said, "Join us." I knew I had to leave, to escape from the clutches of my creepy neighbor and whatever dark forces he had unleashed. I sold my house and moved far away, but the memory of Mr. Jacobs and his midnight rituals still haunts my dreams. A reminder that sometimes evil can live right next door. The stolen identity. My neighbor, Mr. Smith, had always been a quiet and unassuming man. But one day, his behavior took a disturbing turn. He began to mimic my every move. If I mowed the lawn, he would be out there with his lawnmower, even if his grass didn't need cutting. If I painted my front door, he would paint his the same color. It was as if he had become obsessed with me. One night, as I sat in my living room, I saw Mr. Smith outside my window, staring in at me with a sinister grin. He began to copy my actions in a grotesque parody, mimicking my every movement as if he were mocking me. I called the police, but when they arrived, Mr. Smith claimed he had done nothing wrong. He denied everything, and there was no evidence to prove otherwise. As the days passed, his obsession with me only grew. He began to dress like me, adopting my style and mannerisms. It was as if he was trying to steal my identity to become me. I installed security cameras around my house, hoping to catch evidence of his bizarre behavior. But one night, I watched in horror as the footage showed Mr. Smith breaking into my home. He walked through the rooms, touching my belongings, and even sleeping in my bed. I confronted him the next day, demanding to know why he was doing this. His response sent chills down my spine. He said he wanted to become me, to take over my life and erase my existence. Terrified for my safety, I moved away and cut all ties with my former neighbor. But the memory of Mr. Smith and his disturbing obsession still haunts me. A reminder that sometimes the scariest horrors can be found right next door.